Lec22. Let's come back to our lectures. Yeah. Reached the point of hitting the last slide in lecture 21, I guess it is. I thought apparently there were more, so stopped there and shouldn't have. We'll go back to that slide and look at the information there, at least as a review, and then proceed to the lecture 22. I'll now switch to the desktop. So we recall that there are ventral and dorsal mesenteries, referred to as mesogastrium, the mesentery proper, and then mesocolon, the transverse mesocolon, sigmoid mesocolon, and things like that. So initially, the entire length of the gut tube has both a dorsal and a ventral mesentery. The dorsal mesentery stays or is lost secondarily in all cases because the neurovascular bundle is delivered through that dorsal mesentery. The ventral mesentery persists in certain locations due to a few other reasons, like organs developing within it, remnants of embryonic and fetal vasculature, such as the umbilical vein and things like that. So there are some remnants of the ventral mesentery, remnants or derivatives, another way of stating it. And the lesser omentum between the lesser curvature of the stomach and the liver is a prime example. And the falciform ligament that suspends the liver on the anterior body wall. So structures grow out into the ventral mesentery, as we will see in the upcoming lecture, to develop into the liver and a few other things. And therefore, we get a persistence of the ventral mesentery there, but basically we lose it everywhere else. So the term dorsal mesentery is logically the one to give greater emphasis to because there's more of it. And we need to describe its extension. So it's a double layer of peritoneum. We've talked about the development of the peritoneal cavity. So now we understand visceral and parietal layers, and where they come together and go to the intestine is called mesentery, and that's where it's carrying the neurovascular bundle. So that's the definition of the adult form or the late embryonic and fetal form, because ventral mesentery basically has disappeared except for what we just described above. So it is a double layer of the peritoneum where the parietal peritoneum is reflecting off and suspending the visceral peritoneum on top of the gut tube that has this remaining dorsal mesentery. So it encloses the gastrointestinal tract, as we had indicated. Basically, it forms the serosa on the surface of the organ. We talked about the walls of the gut tube last time. The visceral peritoneum is the same as the serosa on the organ, the external surface of the organ. So it extends from the lower end of the esophagus to the cloaca region of the hindgut, and it connects the gastrointestinal tract to the posterior abdominal wall. So in this definition and the description of its extension, or the extent to which we would find it, we're thinking of the early embryo when the first two balloons have collapsed down, and there's a dorsal mesentery basically all the way from the esophagus back to the cloacal region. That's going to get, that single linear attachment is going to get twisted and contorted as the intestine grows long and has to coil up and change its position, as we will see through the progression of lectures coming up. So the list of the major parts of the dorsal mesentery, we already talked about the one for the stomach, dorsal mesogastrium. We can call the mesentery proper, and then each little part of it. We do give some specific attention to a dorsal mesoduodenum because structures will grow into that. And then there's that mesentery proper for the rest of the small intestine as well. and then a dorsal mesocolon, some of which will persist and some of which will be lost. So we proceed to that type of a discussion in the near future. What are the derivatives of the dorsal mesogastrium? We followed that, the gastrophrenic ligament. So the dorsal mesentery has a reflection onto the diaphragm, so gastrophrenic. It has, as we will see, the spleen grows within the dorsal mesogastrium. Laina is another term for the spleen. So the gastrolainal ligament goes from the dorsal aspect of the greater curvature of the stomach on over to the spleen. The phrenico-lainal from the spleen is suspended at the where the stomach, the esophagus comes through the diaphragm. The spleen is suspended from the diaphragm just off a little bit to the left and posteriorly. So there is a phrenico-lainal ligament. And then a lieno-renal ligament. So this whole area is just kind of like dropping a sheet into that space. And there are these little thickened areas where structures are suspended from each other. So the stomach from the diaphragm, the stomach suspended, or the spleen suspended from the stomach, the spleen suspended from the diaphragm, the kidney suspended from the spleen. So this is what we're seeing in this area. The one that we really focused our attention on, of course, was the greater omentum, and you certainly should be expected to recognize the greater omentum as being the major derivative of the dorsal mesogastrium. We now proceed to lecture 22, the digestive system 2. We'll talk about the duodenum, the liver, the pancreas, and the spleen. And so as we proceed into this, knowing that there will be a third discussion for Friday, I had not had the opportunity to talk with Marco about covering the lecture on this Friday, so I don't plan to have him do it. My plan is to have the lecture for Friday copied and made available online for viewing by Friday at this time. So I will be taping that lecture and providing it to the academic technology people to get it posted tomorrow. So we will not, I will not be present in class for a lecture on Friday. You can come at that time if you want to view the lecture online. Otherwise, you can view that Friday lecture at your leisure. I have a seminar at St. Philip's College, the speaker for which I am hosting, so I need to attend to that on Friday, and the time conflicts directly with this time, lecture schedule. I apologize for that conflict and schedule confusion. So let's now talk about the development of the duodenum, the liver, the pancreas, and the spleen. So the duodenum develops in the caudal foregut, but it's the cranial midgut. So the duodenum is that junction of foregut and midgut. Remember that foregut ended where the umbilical stalk attached to the internal, the gut tube inside the embryo, and then the yolk stalk ending caudally is the junction between midgut and hindgut. So the duodenum is right there at that junction in the early embryo, where the yolk stalk comes into the embryo and is internalized. So the upper portion, or the more proximal portion toward the mouth of the duodenum, is foregut, and then the lower portion is midgut. It grows rapidly, forming a C-shaped loop ultimately as these lengths of tube grow in length we know that there's going to be a tremendous displacement. The abdomen's small, the liver's occupying most of it. There's that giant liver bulge. So this linear tube is going to change shape quite quickly. So it rotates to the right as the stomach rotates. So we saw the stomach rotating over to the left, shifting the lower portion, the pylorus of the stomach, toward the right-hand side. So the first part of the duodenum from the foregut is going to be shifted to the right. And then this C shape is going to show a curve from the right over to the left side, just slightly offset from the left midline, where it takes its adult position. So there must be some type of rotation of the midgut to produce this curling of the duodenum to form a C shape from right side over to left side. So there must be some twisting or rotation of the midgut that pulls it around like that. And we'll take a look at that. That basically, I think, is the Friday lecture. So what this means is that the duodenum started off with the dorsal and the ventral mesentery. It loses almost all of its ventral mesentery. There's just a little bit that remains, and we'll see that in a moment, called the hepatoduodenal ligament. Goes from the hepato, the liver, to the upper part of the duodenum, the hepatoduodenal ligament, which is a portion of the lesser omentum. So we'll see that when it comes up in just a moment. So for now, what we want to do is describe basically what happens to the dorsal mesoduodenum and talk about or define retroperitoneal as having a primary retroperitoneal type of position or a secondary retroperitoneal type of a position for an organ in the fetal and adult stage, fetal through adult stage. So as the duodenum is pushed back toward the body wall to form that C shape when the midgut rotates, it comes around like this. The dorsal mesentery gets plastered against the posterior body wall, and basically we lose the dorsal mesoduodenum. It just becomes incorporated into the parietal peritoneum on the body wall. What this does is it places now the duodenum outside of the peritoneal cavity, outside of the greater omental sac. Even though the mesenteric structures are suspended in the greater omental sac, we know that they're not really inside it. They're not in the intraperitoneal cavity, but they are suspended and free-floating. We said a mesenteric structure we can pick up and move around. A non-mesenteric structure is plastered against the posterior body wall. We can't pick it up and move it around. Now we change this term of non-mesenteric to retroperitoneal. So retro means behind or outside of, certainly, but behind the peritoneal cavity. So the kidneys are a prime example of structures that were retroperitoneal from the beginning, and they never had a mesentery. They never lost a mesentery because they didn't have it in the first place. So they are primarily retroperitoneal. They're outside the peritoneum, posteriorly. They've been there from their very development and never had a mesentery, so they couldn't have lost it. Secondarily, retroperitoneal structures, such as the duodenum, started off with the dorsal mesentery, but they lost it, and as they lose it, they end up being retroperitoneal, outside the peritoneum. So they are indeed retroperitoneal, but we call them secondarily retroperitoneal because it reminds us that the neurovascular bundle that used to be in that dorsal mesentery now is also with that organ in the retroperitoneal space. So it's just a very specialized nomenclature for these types of organs. For surgery, for visualization, non-invasive visualization, or even the sectioning visualization that we'll take a look at, it becomes very important to keep these things in mind. Now, another definition of secondarily retroperitoneal for gut tube is the anterior surface is covered with the serosa, right, the visceral peritoneum, serosa on the front of a piece of the gut tube, and the posterior surface has an adventitia. It is not covered by the simple squamous or mesothelial membrane, the visceral peritoneum. So another definition that differentiates the retroperitoneal structures is the anterior surface being covered by serosa, the posterior surface being covered by adventitia, where there is no simple squamous epithelium. The connective tissue is continuous with the connective tissue of the posterior body wall. So that's the introduction of that. I know it's a bulky introduction, but hopefully by seeing it again and again, it will become very useful concept and terminology set in our minds. So it's supplied by the celiac and the superior mesenteric arteries. The celiac artery we've already introduced as the artery of the foregut. Superior mesenteric artery we've already introduced as the artery of the midgut. So the duodenum, the upper portion, will be provided blood supply by the celiac trunk, and the lower portion from the midgut will be provided blood supply by the superior mesenteric. So the arterial supply in this area has many different anastomoses between celiac branches and superior mesenteric branches. So many links at the arteriole level, just straight up linkages. In other words, this is very important for any type of laceration or surgical transection of a vessel. You can't just clamp one end of it. Typically for an artery, you can clamp the end proximal to the source. Here, if you did that thinking of only the celiac artery clamped on that end, you've got full blood pressure coming through the other supply at the anastomosis. You cut that vessel and it's just going to bleed at the high pressure of the systolic diastolic systems. So these bits of information become very important in that forum. So during weeks 5 and 6, the lumen is actually closed because of the epithelial mitosis. We said when we hear this, we know that there can be problems. So that'll be part of the problems that we will see emerging. So now let's take a look at some illustrations. Dorsal aorta, the yolk stalk. So we follow yolk stalk back. We have junction of midgut and foregut. So we know the duodenum is going to be developing right in this area. The developing stomach is a little bit higher, and we see the hepatic diverticulum growing into the ventral mesentery. So we know this is ventral mesentery, and this is dorsal, mesentery back here. The peritoneal cavity is reflected as being this large space. So we're going to follow what happens to these as we proceed. Now we are seeing the duodenum developing here and getting some bulges and progressing external growths of cords of cells. Dorsally, there's going to be a pancreatic bud going into the dorsal mesogastrium. Ventrally, there's going to be that hepatic diverticulum that will eventually split into gallbladder and then give off these hepatic cords, the primordium of the liver. The liver will develop from a variety of sources, so we're going to focus on that a little bit later. So don't picture these cells becoming the entire liver. They're going to interface with mesenchymal cells in the ventral mesentery and collectively contribute to the stroma, parenchyma, vasculature, and the duct system that drains the bile. So it's going to get a bit complex as we proceed. So just a little bit of heating there is in order. So with this illustration, then we see the dorsal pancreatic bud continues to grow out into the dorsal mesogastrium. We see the diaphragm above here, superiorly separating the abdominal from the thoracic cavity. We see the ventral diverticulum. The hepatic diverticulum now has sprouted a ventral pancreatic bud. The gallbladder has begun to dilate. Its connection back to that original structure, now called the bile duct, is called the cystic duct. And then the liver will be developing at the tip of that. And again, this is a bit misleading. There's a tremendous cellular interaction, mesenchymal cell and endodermal cell interaction to produce the entire functional liver. And we will delineate that as time progresses. We see these arrows indicating the rotation of this portion of the duodenum, in part related to the rotation of the stomach, the dorsal curve of the stomach, greater curvature going to the left, and the lesser curvature or ventral surface coming to the right. So there's going to be some twisting and contorting of these structures within the ventral mesentery and the dorsal mesentery at the level of the duodenum. And this can lead to, of course, it leads to the adult arrangement of these structures, but more importantly, clinically, it can lead to developmental anomalies that interfere with the normal functioning of the gut tube. So with the collective turning from the stomach and the midgut rotation, as we will describe later, and we have mentioned already, the dorsal pancreatic bud and the ventral pancreatic buds will be approximated, and they join and begin fusing, and therefore we know from our familiarity with adult anatomy, there's a major and a minor pancreatic duct. The major, of course, coming from the dorsal pancreatic bud, and the minor shown here. The bile duct goes from the duodenum right up to the liver and has this branch coming off to the gallbladder called the cystic duct. So we keep that adult anatomy in mind as well. So this development of the liver and the gallbladder is apparently simplistic. It definitely was simplified in the illustrations we just monitored. We will see that it's a bit more complex now as we proceed. So derived from the ventral outgrowth, the hepatic diverticulum, we've seen that. It's from the caudal foregut during week 4. This expands and pushes out against the septum transversum that contributes part of the diaphragm, the central tendon of the diaphragm, as we know. The endoderm gives rise to the hepatocytes. So the parenchymal cells of the liver indeed do originate from the endoderm. Obviously, the cells, the epithelial lining of the biliary tree, all the small structures that we'll see inside the liver, and the bile duct and the cystic duct in the gallbladder, the epithelial lining originates from endoderm as well. The mesoderm gives rise to the blood cells that are produced by the liver, the blood-producing cells. It occurs in the liver at a certain point, and other cells called Kupffer cells that are phagocytic cells. So if we think of it, these are cells that logically would be developing from mesoderm or mesenchyme. So in a question format, from which structures do A, the parenchyma, and B, the stroma of the liver develop? So this will give us a bit more of an understanding of this. And what is the principal function of the liver in the fetus? So first, very early, we talked about parenchymal cells, basically the functional cells of an organ, versus the stroma, the connective tissue structure of the organ to hold it together and to encapsulate it. So as soon as we hear connective tissue, we're associating stroma with mesoderm or mesodermal mesenchyme And the parenchyma, we now know, originates from the endoderm. So the endodermal epithelium of the distal end of the foregut is what grows into the septum transversum and differentiates into the hepatocytes and the biliary tree that connects these functional parenchymal cells that produce the bile, connects it back to the duodenum for the dumping of the bile into the duodenum. The stroma of the liver originates from the septum transversum mesoderm, or mesenchyme. And the primary function or principal function of the liver in the fetus is the hematopoietic function and bile formation. So the bile formation we now associate entirely with endodermal cell origin. The hematopoietic function we associate with mesodermal cell origin. Let's just read through the legend for figure 12.8, and then we'll proceed to take a look at that. So we'll be looking at illustrations that show the caudal part of the septum transversum. It is going to be stretched, and it will be membranous because it is a mesentery covered by mesothelial membranes, and it forms that ventral mesentery. We'll see a median section of the 4-week embryo, then transverse section showing the expansion of the peritoneal cavity, and then the sagittal section of a 5-week embryo, and then a transverse section of the embryo after the formation of the dorsal and the ventral mesenteries. And we'll see that the liver is joined to the ventral abdominal wall, forming the falciform ligament ultimately, and the attachment to the duodenum will be part of the lesser omentum. So here we see the hepatic diverticulum and its vascular supply from the foregut artery, the celiac trunk. And this hepatic diverticulum is growing into the septum transversum with association with the mesenchyme or mesodermal cells in this area. Now we're looking at a transverse section, and we see that it is a patent structure, this diverticulum, and the hepatic diverticulum grows into the mesenchyme, but it isn't a solid mass. It begins to spread out some so that some mesenchyme can come in between our fingers, if you want to think of it that way, and begin to form the vasculature that has a very specialized association with the hepatocytes. And we know that there's a very specialized organization of the two-dimensional and three-dimensional organization of the hepatocytes with reference to the vasculature and the biliary duct system. So there are these apparent cords of mesenchyme distributed among the diverticulum endodermal cells invading this area of the septum transversum. Of course, the peritoneal cavity is beginning to expand a little bit. Ultimately, it will surround the liver. The liver will be suspended from the diaphragm and the anterior body wall a little bit, the falciform ligament, in this upper portion of the abdominal cavity. If we jump up and down, our liver bounces up and down, but it's suspended from the thoracoabdominal diaphragm. When we breathe in, the liver is pushed down. When we breathe out, the liver is drawn back up by the diaphragm closer into the thoracic region. You can't say the thoracic cavity because it never breaks through the thoracoabdominal diaphragm to actually get into the thoracic cavity. We note that the laryngotracheal bud is developing at about this same time, so these things are occurring simultaneously. As much as we can, we want to keep this in mind so we don't lose that perspective that a lot of these things are happening simultaneously. We always pointed out the heart bulge and the liver bulge on the surface. So this is the reminder that these events are occurring simultaneously. Here we see the length of the gut tube and its proximity to the quite well-formed umbilical cord at this time. The the allantoic stalk extends into there, as well the yolk stalk extends into the umbilical cord. So we already see that there's this bend in the midgut, and then finally the hindgut, it has its pretty linear arrangement down into the cloaca. So there's been a rapid growth in the midgut length to end up in this shape. So that'll become important in the near future. But again, we come back and we see the developing liver in the ventral mesentery. So whatever was incorporated from the septum transversum is now basically being referred to as the ventral mesentery of the stomach, ventral mesogastrium, and the ventral mesoduodenum, as it would be referred to in this area. The dorsal mesogastrium and dorsal mesoduodenum are here. You see the dorsal pancreatic bud growing into the dorsal mesogastrium. So we take a plane of section and take a peek at it here, kind of three-dimensionalized. First, the neural tube, the origin of some of the muscle and bone, the dorsal aorta in this area. So we know this is dorsal. So this will be dorsal mesentery, and this is ventral mesentery at the level of the duodenum. So at this level, we don't see the dorsal pancreatic bud growing into the dorsal mesoduodenum, but we do see the liver bud within the ventral mesoduodenum, mesogastrium, and it kind of splits that into two parts. The part between the liver and the duodenum and the lesser curvature of the stomach is called the lesser omentum. The part of the ventral mesentery that attached to the diaphragm and the anterior body wall. On the other side of the liver, the anterior side of the liver, superior anterior side, is the falciform ligament. So we can see the reflection of the parietal peritoneum off the body wall across the falciform ligament, remnant of ventral mesentery, onto the surface of the liver. This would be visceral peritoneum then by definition. And then you can call this whatever you want. Lesser omentum is what we'll go with. Still is kind of a mesentery structure. So it's neither visceral or parietal peritoneum. But then it reflects back on as the visceral peritoneum comes back off the body, the organ structure as as mesentery, and then reflected onto the posterior body wall as parietal peritoneum. So what are the derivatives of the ventral mesentery? We've talked about these already. We just looked at the lesser omentum and the falciform ligament in a bit more detail. We've seen a bit more of that dorsal mesentery and its extension. This is the exact same slide we started with. And we have a better appreciation for dorsal mesogastrium, dorsal mesoduodenum, and we will see more of these others as we proceed. And we at least still remember the greater omentum, but not the others. But let's go back and continue following the development of the structures in this area. We now see the ventral mesentery. Now it's more adult terminology. The ventral mesentery at the body wall and the diaphragm is the falciform ligament. At the inferior free margin of the falciform ligament, we find the umbilical vein. This will obviously become obliterated when the umbilical cord falls off after birth, and so it becomes called the round ligament of the liver. So the inferior free margin of the falciform ligament is called the round ligament of the liver. It's round because it contains the obliterated umbilical vein. So the adult human anatomy comes in and we begin to understand its formation from this perspective of embryonic studies. We see in the portion of the ventral mesentery, ventral mesogastrium, and ventral mesoduodenum, between the liver and those structures, lesser curvature, and on down to the upper portion of the duodenum, is the lesser omentum that has two parts, a hepatoduodenal ligament and a hepatogastric ligament. So anatomists and physicians like these diversity of names. So if you want to be general, you can be general. If you want to be specific, if you say the hepatoduodenal ligament, very restricted in what people should be thinking about, and a flood of information should come in about the contents of this, its location. It forms the boundary of the foramen between the greater omental sac and the lesser omental sac. So that those words should trigger a flood of information. So this is the reason for these specialty names, other than merely being descriptive. So the dorsal mesentery, then we see the celiac trunk giving branches. This little branch creeping down, starting to form an anastomosis with the artery of the midgut, the superior mesenteric artery. So we begin to see this complexity of vasculature forming, just looking at the arterial side of things, basically ignoring the companion vasculature, lymphatics, and the venous system. We know that the nervous system is accompanying this as well. This vasculature is the major route of delivery of the sympathetic fibers to the gut tube. So on all of these, we've all heard, my son likes to wrestle with me, and just recently he got a pretty good, solid kick from me in the chest region, and I was explaining to him what the solar plexuses are as he was writhing on the floor. I don't think he recalls any of the lecture, but he sure was mad at me. But anyway, we'll make it a little bit easier for all of you. The sympathetic ganglia that surround the celiac artery, the celiac ganglion, and all of the postganglionic axons that come off it and form a plexus of fibers delivered through the vasculature to all these organs, that's the solar plexus. So when that is stunned, you get quite a shock to the sympathetic innervation to all these organs. And it makes people curl up on the ground and grunt and moan, even if it's your 10-year-old kid that you kicked in the chest. So I don't beat him up, but we wrestle pretty good. I got my black and blue marks in sore areas too. He's not a little puny guy anymore. So quickly then we see the inferior mesenteric artery providing arterial supply to the hindgut, and we now see ventral mesentery disappearing from the rest of the gut tube system. So the liver is the site of the blood cell formation starting week 6. The bile begins to form 6 weeks later, week 12. The caudal part of the diverticulum gives rise to the gallbladder. We saw that. The bile duct enters the dorsal duodenum because the duodenum gets twisted around. What was ventral now basically becomes dorsal because of the twisting and rotation. So it's original ventral duodenum and becomes posterior ultimately. Connected to the stomach by the ventral mesentery. So here we see a view of the liver and the stomach, the pylorem of the stomach, and the first part, and then the second part of the duodenum, and we see basically on its dorsal surface this little opening into the duodenum. So that is the original site of the outgrowth of the hepatic diverticulum. And it splits, and we see a duct going over that way, obviously to the pancreas that is lobular and filling in this area. And then all these ghost views for Halloween coming up. We see the bile duct, or the common bile duct, leading up to the branch where the cystic duct comes off, and the common hepatic duct that leads up to form the left and the right hepatic ducts. And then that divides up even more and more. So it's almost sounding reminiscent of the discussion of the respiratory system. It goes out, divides and divides and divides, and gets smaller and smaller and smaller, ultimately to be closely associated with the arrays of the hepatocytes. So what we see is the cut-free margin of the lesser omentum. The portion of the lesser omentum from the liver to the duodenum is the hepatoduodenal ligament. So here we see the contents of the hepatoduodenal ligament, the hepatic artery from the celiac trunk, and the hepatic portal vein from the portal venous system, circulatory system, directly from the capillary bed in the intestines, directly into the capillary bed in the liver. By definition, a portal system is capillary bed to capillary bed between arterial side and venous side capillary beds. And we see this full extension. So these are mesenchymal structures, and these are endodermal origin. The epithelial lining of these are, so we get inside, that epithelium is endodermal, but all the smooth muscle and connective tissue and vasculature on the outside is mesodermal origin. What's missing from here? Anytime neurovascular bundle or vascular bundle should be the nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers coming into this area, and as well lymphatics. And then, of course, the remainder of this is the hepatogastric ligament. So this question, identify mesenteric structure at the tip of the arrow, you would either have to select the lesser omentum as the best answer if the hepatogastric ligament was not one of the choices. Because we see the contents of the hepatoduodenal ligament of the lesser omentum, we know that the hepatoduodenal ligament isn't even here, so it could only be the hepatogastric portion of the lesser omentum. So again, you're always asked to provide the best possible answer on exam questions. So here we see the cords, the arrays of the hepatocytes, and we know that they form these 2, 4, 6 hexagonal-shaped structures, the lobules of the liver, and the vasculature comes in and forms these triads with the component of the biliary system, the bile duct fuel, ULE, meaning small, the hepatic portal vein portion, and the hepatic artery portion, and the blood flow is from periphery to central, where the central vein is going to take it to the systemic venous circulation through the hepatic veins, and then the bile is going to go in the other direction from these little bile canaliculi out to these bile ductules that eventually will collect together into the right and the left hepatic bile ducts and so on and so forth. So endodermal origin for the epithelium inside these bile ductules. All the rest of this bundle and this triad is mesenchymal origin, including the connective tissue on the surface of the bile ductule. But these parenchymal cells of the hepatocyte lobule are endodermal origin. So here we see a cross-section through an embryo, and we can identify the stomach. We can identify the gastroduodenal junction. So this would be, the mesenteric structure would be the gastroduodenal ligament or the lesser omentum. So we see the adrenal glands forming here posteriorly. It's quite large at this point. The dorsal aorta, the neural tube, beginning of the formation of the vertebral column, and then all the rest of this basically is liver forming out here, so that giant liver bulge is what is present. So I guess I'll have to complete this portion on the pancreas and the malformations, and then the remaining lecture for Friday, and have those prepared for posting. I appreciate your time and attention, and I will see you again on Monday. I'll stay here for a brief while if in case there are any questions.